Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to special topics on the Analects of Confucius. Now, I've done a lecture on Confucius and Confucianism in general, and on Mencius, which is an important step in understanding Confucianism, of course. But I thought it would be worthwhile to stop and take a close look at the actual text of the Analects, which is probably the core, or certainly one of the core texts of the Confucian tradition. And in reading the Analects, it's important to remember that, like the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist and Jesus wasn't a Christian, like Confucius wasn't a Confucianist. It's his ideas and his thoughts and his development that went on to form the core of what later came to be called Confucianism, but what, of course, he was developing and exploring in his lifetime. And so what's come down to us is not necessarily precisely what was in his mind or in his thoughts. And what's emphasized is change, and there's, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pages of scholarship over 2,000 years exploring and developing the ideas of Confucianism. So, as always with philosophical texts, I think it's good to take a pause at moments, step back and look at the actual texts. And so in this one, I just want to look at 5 passages and then talk about how they relate to Confucianism as perhaps Confucius thought about them, or at least as some key ideas that were presented as Confucius ideas by his followers. And again, we have texts that seem to come from very early in his time. And so we don't have things directly in his hand, but we have things from, one generation or two removed, which is pretty good relative to ancient manuscripts. It's well documented, lots of supporting texts outside of the Confucius tradition, etc., etc. So it really is a remarkable textual history that we get when we get Confucianism. But it's good always to start with the Analects and the core texts themselves. And so again, I've done a lecture on Confucianism, so if you want a fuller introduction, it would maybe be good to start there and come back, but just some core principles that I want to explore in this. Of course, he was a thinker in the spring-autumn period. It was a time of unrest. It was a time when people looked back and thought, oh, it used to be better a couple hundred years ago or 100 years ago. So in case you thought this was a new idea, nope. 2,500 years ago, right around 500 BCE, Confucius was looking back to the past and saying, wow, if you really want to do things right, you want to do things the way they used to do them. So 2,500 years ago, they were looking back. So like the Greeks look back to their golden age, and similar societies have done the same thing. This notion that we're constantly in this state of decay seems to be a popular rhetorical ploy for trying to convince people of your ideas. Excuse me. So, what I think is really important for reading closely in the Analects, though, is to understand what he's trying to do, because it's rarely articulated. It's implied everywhere. It's one of these weird things where it's implied everywhere, but not necessarily directly stated very often, or in a way that we understand clearly, because we've lost, if we ever had, we don't have them, the references to the Chinese history of the time, which is very prominent. So if you are going to read the Analects, it's good to have one that has a nice collection of notes, because it will help clarify, if nothing else, the history associated with the passages, because people are mentioned, situations are mentioned that we just don't have any knowledge of. So like the Penguin is an easy to access and easy to read one that has lots of helpful notes and a good introduction, etc., etc. The Penguin books tend to be really good on that front in general. Analects are fine in particular. So in Confucius's life, what he was trying to do was 2 things. One is probably trying to do a lot of things, but at least 2 things. One, he was trying to establish himself as a minister, if you will, an advisor to an important court. He had limited success in this. He did get some jobs, etc., etc. And 2 was to train up and educate a cadre of followers who themselves could then fill ministerial courts and positions and then influence how governments worked. And the distinction is amazing, and you have to keep this in mind the entire time you're reading the Analects, is for the Occidental tradition, the Western tradition. what you see primarily, although not exclusively, of course, is an emphasis on laws and rules and institutions. So like in the United States, it's the Constitution. That is the big, the appeal to the Constitution. However many debates there are about this, the idea that you have these core texts and these core laws, and if you can get the laws right, then you'll get everything right. You see this in Aristotle wrote about laws. Plato had a book called The Laws. So there was this concept that we has emphasized much more heavily, if you have a democracy, well, that's better than other forms of government because the institutions and the structures of the institutions are superior. For Confucius, he looked at the world around him and he said, no, the only way to have good government is to have good people governing. And so pretty much everything, not everything, but the vast majority of what he writes is within this context of saying, how do you get people to a place where they can be good ministers, good leaders, good dukes, good servants inside of the context of a well-organized, well-balanced society that is, brings prosperity and peace and all the great things about a good society to the fore, because he felt that this had been lost. Again, this is why it always appeals to the past, and can be rediscovered and be recreated. And so he's consistently asking these questions. Interestingly, for his time, again, something that we lose context with, he was something of a, radical is too strong, because he's, it's very subtle but consistent and powerful, is he believed in meritocracy. And he over and over again, he says, this peasant has the great force of humaneness, the Ren, which is one of the most important concepts in his teachings. Or this simple person or this quiet person, don't be deceived by looks or presentation or flattery. Look to the core of a human, and sometimes it's not the nobles or the educated men who have this. It's the simple peasants, the workers, the countrymen, the sort of quote middle class, if you will. Like you can find these people everywhere. There are not a lot of them, but they exist in every strata of society. And he really emphasized the meritocratic nature of good governance rather than the inherited. So of course they had an aristocracy, and the aristocracy said, whoever inherits the power, they have the power. And, he couldn't just say, no, overthrow the aristocracy, but he's very consistent in saying the aristocrats need to be properly trained. Good aristocrats need to displace bad aristocrats. And that it is the ability of those people to appoint good ministers and be good leaders that will set the quality of your state or your country or county or region, whatever it is you're working in. And that there was no way of avoiding this. There's no magic constitution or set of laws or anything that's going to bring this to the fore. And so his belief in meritocracy, of people striving to be good, was really central to and ran counter to many of the traditions of his time. Second, another aspect of this is the degree to which he felt example and action were important. So consistently when you read the Analects, beware of flattery, beware of the easy seeming person, or the very glib person, the flashy person, right? You need to be able to find the core of the value of a human being, because of course if you're a duke, you're going to be surrounded by people who want to flatter you because they want these positions that bring wealth and power. And so for them to be able to sort out amongst their ministers and amongst their courtiers who actually has value and who doesn't is hugely important. And so around this concept of this desire to have a stable society built on quality leaders, he had several principles which were absolutely central. Now, the goal of all this is to be a gentleman. No one knows exactly how to translate this, junzi. That's terrible Chinese, but it's a gentleman or a nobleman. But it didn't mean noble by birth. It meant noble by achievement, greatness in yourself, because you sought education, you sought wisdom, you were an upright man, and you inhabited those and embodied those all the time. So to be a gentleman is the ultimate goal. And what makes a gentleman more than anything else is humaneness, which is this concept of always keeping like a big-heartedness, awareness, a caring for the people and the goals in mind. And it's really subtle. We're going to explore this as we go forward. But it's not simply kindness, but it is an awareness of the human condition at all times and always taking this into account. And then the way you achieve this sort of humaneness is with a couple of important steps here. One is wisdom. And wisdom, as we'll see, doesn't just mean wisdom as we traditionally think. It really, then going back to what I had said earlier, was the ability to judge people's characters and situations within the context of humaneness. So that at different times, the same problem, because different people are involved, might have a different answer. Right? And so wisdom is to be able to judge the character, the quality of people, and the character and the quality of different situations accurately. Then you had one that's really hard for us to understand, so I'll spend a little more time on it when we get to that passage, which is ritual propriety. And this notion that a lot of what nobles did was a series of rituals, of prayers and offerings and formal ceremonial moments that Confucius thought played a very significant part in organizing a harmonious society. And he thought this for a couple of reasons, but he thought it was a performative nature. Again, he emphasizes acts all the time. Don't listen to speech, don't listen to these things. Look at what people do. And if you were able to and did commit yourself to humbly and ably performing the necessary rituals and courtesies of life, this suggested that you were, in fact, an upright and correct person. So ritual propriety was a huge one for him. Truthfulness, and again, truthfulness, Li, ritual propriety, Jin, truthfulness, hugely important. Because, and again, it's a little subtle. It means, to tell the truth, keep your word, big value on that. Again, doing what you say is very important. But part of truthfulness is also saying when you don't know something that you don't know it, and also being able to judge clearly and accurately, of course this relates to wisdom, how much the speaking you're doing is not for flattery, it's for accurate assessment. So while truthfulness does mean true and keeping your word and being reliable, it also means accurate assessment and not speaking to get a point across or to win or to convince somebody, but just trying to be true and accurate in your assessments so that when you communicate, you're not putting yourself to the fore, you're putting whatever is under discussion to the fore in as fair and open a manner as possible. Very tricky. And again, when you're thinking about an environment of courtiers and of nobles, right? Everyone is always speaking in a way that they think is going to get them moved forward, is get them advanced, to have their position improved, as opposed to like, we should tell the truth here. In a complete tangent, I've been listening to a book on the Ukraine war, and one of the things this author articulates is that apparently Putin wanted to believe that Ukraine would welcome the Russians as liberators. So for years, the security service had been telling him and providing with evidence and paying spies and all this, saying, that they weren't going to fight. They were going to welcome the Russian invaders as liberators. And of course, this turns out not to be accurate in any way. But because they all knew this is what their leader wanted to hear and that there could be very negative ramifications for not saying that, they weren't speaking truthfully. They weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in getting rewards and, not being shot, which is reasonable. But that ability to speak truthfully rather than to speak for various kinds of favor is hugely important in the Confucius tradition. However, and again, the Ukraine example is of note here, and why I brought it up, it also requires a nobleman, a leader who's ever in charge, who is himself, and of course it would always be a himself in this context, himself was sufficiently upright and had enough ren and was enough of a gentleman that he could listen and hear that, oh, this person is not trying to flatter me, they're not trying to anger me, they're trying to speak the truth as far as they can see it. So it's more than just telling the truth and being reliable there. And so these core set of values all sort of mold together to create this sense of what it means to be humane. And as we'll see, however, none of this is written in stone. There is no guideline. There is no simple set of rules that make this possible. And so the final note I'd like to make is he is anti-dogmatic, which is funny because, all these sayings come down to us and they seem dogmatic at times. In fact, as Confucius presented them and as he's presented in the Analects, he was always discussing these, thinking about them, exploring them, qualifying them, often giving different answers in different contexts. So he wasn't a martinet, and he wasn't a legalist, which was a school, of course, in China that he was opposed to. He was a humanitarian, if you will. He believed in humaneness, when there's a lot of elements in every context, and you always just have to do the best you can by reflecting on what seems the wisest, most humane thing that one can do. And so the richness of the Analects come not from a clear set of rules or a clear set of guidelines, but from their invitation to have a conversation with the texts and think about what each of these dialogues might mean, how could they be interpreted differently, how you might respond to them differently in different contexts. And I think both this is the richness of the text, but also in thinking about philosophical texts generally, many philosophical texts like these, like Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, which we did a little bit, invite this pause. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to model, this notion of pausing and going, oh, you don't just read it and go, okay, I've got that. You pause and you go, oh, what does that mean? How do I respond? How does this mean in context? And so people often ask me, oh, how long does it take to read a book? How quickly can you read one of these texts? And it's like, wow, I don't know how to answer it because, it could take me a week to work through a paragraph because you're just like in this, sort of interrogative mode, or you might just glance through it because it's like it doesn't interest me or it's not resonating with me or, something like that. So, how you respond to different texts really can be highly variable, and it makes it, difficult to answer some question like that. But in any case, speed is not the goal, that's for sure. Understanding, reflection, comprehension, these are more important. So again, a meritocratic idea of creating upright men who can perform civic duties that will create an environment of humaneness and prosperity for all. Big emphasis on for all. All right, so 5 passages. So this is sort of the Analects in 5 passages. But by the way, I don't know if these aren't random selections, but they may as well be random. I could have picked any other bunch of passages and they would be great too. So 1.3, so this is right at the beginning of the text. He rolls us out. Those of crafty words and ingratiating expression are rarely humane. So this is Ren, humaneness. And again, if you think about this in the context of the noble person that we just talked about and the courtiers, it's like, oh, if someone is very crafty in their words and very pleasing in the way they express things, and a lot of education at this time, and again, Confucius carries on this tradition, is learn the poetry, learn the classics, and then when you speak to people, you speak in literal quotes of classic passages to express your ideas. So it would be as if when someone asked you a question, you responded with a passage from some Goethe poetry or something, where you would just start giving back poetic line and the person go, oh, I see your idea. And then of ingratiating expression. So if you present yourself as pleasing, very, again, ingratiating, and you have crafty words, he's like, oh, Now be suspicious, right? This is something that should make you worried, because this person is not trying to be humane. They're not trying to get to the heart of things. They're not worried about the well-being of everybody. They're mostly probably concerned with advancing their own position and own station. And so there's this constant tension in Confucius between knowing the classics, knowing the rituals, knowing how to present oneself, being a courteous, kind minister who can be well representative of their master, and this suspicion of exactly those qualities, right? Of all the qualities that he also espouses. He's also like, but just having learning, just knowing the poetry, just dressing correctly, all these forms are external. And be leery of them if that seems to be all there is. Because humaneness at times should cause you to speak in a way that isn't crafty, should cause your expression to be pained or happy, to be uncontrolled, or he does both in the Analects. Your expression should be neutral, to keep your emotions at bay, so that the subject or the topic is what is central, not the emotional content of yours or the other person's. And so this desire, consistent desire for the individual to step back and for the greater context, and often the greater good, quote unquote, whatever that ends up being in the context, is in the fore, means that for the Confucian ideal of a minister, they should be not invisible, but they shouldn't intrude as a person so much. They should intrude as an embodiment of this civic ideal that he has. And so the ultimate gentleman is, while pleasing and easy to be with, it's not the gentleman that comes to the fore, but whatever the task at hand is. And then their ability to deal with that or address it is what fills the space rather than them. So it's sort of a warning against charisma and the over-pleasing courtier and all of the traps that we know from history that have been set and rulers have experienced because of flattery and so on. So that's 1.3. So right from the beginning, he's right there. And two, another one here, this is 3.4, and this is on ritual propriety. And again, ritual propriety is tough for us. And for Confucius, this is part of an entire maybe training ideal. Like just psychologically, if you're dedicated to performing the correct rites in the correct way with the right understanding and the right heart, right? You can't have empty forms. You have to have the right mind and right heart for how you're doing these rituals, excuse me, and bringing them to fruition. That this is a way of training people. Like, oh, if you can learn to do these rituals correctly and focus on the right thing, then when you're dealing with a matter of state, or you're having to deal with an ambassador or some other problem comes up, you'll apply the same kind of conscientiousness, the same kind of awareness of forms and principle to this other task. And you won't have this desire to put yourself to the fore, but you'll keep the task or the question or the wisdom to the fore. So in a ritual, it's not you that's important, it's the gods or the ancestors or whatever the function of the ritual is, that's supposed to be the center. And so you see this in 3.4 when he says, in Li, it is better to be frugal than to be extravagant. In the funeral ritual, it is better to be guided by grief than simply to go about the ritual stipulations. So again, let me do that slowly so we get this in two parts here. Because Lin Fang asked about this, by the way, in the passage 3.4. Somebody asked Confucius, hey, what is the root? What's the most important foundation of ritual propriety? And he says, in ritual propriety, it is better to be frugal than to be extravagant. So again, here's a public opportunity to show yourself. And so if you go out and extravagant, then this suggests that you're making the ritual about you and not about the subject that's supposed to be there. And so, this is very important. Again, this consistent emphasis on what is supposed to be the matter at hand. It's not supposed to be you in this case. It's supposed to be the ritual. And again, as I mentioned from 1.3, if it's a matter of state, it's not supposed to be about crafty words and you being ingratiating. It's supposed to be the matter of state. And that's what's supposed to be front and center. And so if you learn to do rituals properly, then you'll know, it is better to be a little err on the side of frugality, making yourself small, making your impression small, and doing it correctly, than it is to be extravagant and showy so that people are looking at you rather than looking at what's supposed to be happening. So famously, again, use an example from the Greeks, Alcibiades at an Olympics game entered 3 or 4 chariot teams, and having a chariot team was hugely expensive. So entering 3 or 4 of them was just ridiculously extravagant. And then I think he took first, second, and third. He won all the medals, which is even more ridiculous. And so he's just over the top. And he was in this big purple tent, which is again super expensive and also very showy. And then everybody looked at him and thought, oh my gosh, like he's the showman. This is the great moment. He's taking all the glory. But no, for Confucius, this is all wrong, wrong, wrong. It's supposed to be about the athletes. It's supposed to be about the competitors. It's not about his chariot team. He did so much that it stopped being about the race and it started to be about Alcibiades. Unsurprisingly, Alcibiades gets himself in a lot of trouble because he keeps making things about him rather than about the subject theoretically at hand. He was always about him. This is the kind of thing that really drove Confucius mad, is, hey, you're going up to do a prayer and to perform a sacrifice to the mountain gods, and you think that you're going to trick them? Like they don't notice that you're being showy and that you're making it about you rather than them? No, you're not tricking them. They're going to know this. You're violating some core principles here. And he really wanted you to draw back. And so in the public way, it's supposed to be, again, err on the side of frugality rather than extravagance. Then there's the second part of the passage, which is in the funeral ritual, it is to be better to be guided by grief than simply to go about the ritual stipulations. There we go again. So there is no answer in Confucius. He's like, look, if it's a funeral rite, you're upset. Go with your emotions. Go with your grief. That's because if you just go through the funeral ritual in the right way, doing all the right forms, everything is correct, this suggests that you have no humaneness, that you have no great-heartedness, that you really aren't grieving. So if you're going to err on the side of your grief. Don't worry so much about the funeral stipulations. Let your grief speak for you, because people will understand that, or should understand that. And there's many passages where he talks about this and says, it's not the precise form that matters, it's the meaning and the communication that you're delivering when you're doing this. And if your grief is represented by a perfect following of the forms of ritual mourning, he doesn't think you're mourning all that much, right? He suggests that you lack a certain human empathy, that you're not moved enough. And so be real, be true, be human. And so a gentleman doesn't always follow the forms perfectly. A gentleman knows when to follow the forms and when the forms need to be broken and when they need to be modified and why. And that's what is constantly being asked for in Confucius, is this reflection on patterns, reflections on behavior, reflections on environment, and then sort of an exploration and reflection on those that suggests what's going to be the most humane thing to do, and that thing is what makes you a gentleman. A gentleman, which is the goal of all this, or a nobleman, is the person who best inhabits this and makes this possible. Now, passage 3, 6.8, is kind of on wisdom and carries on these things that I've been talking about. So chapter 6, anecdote 8, Xi asked Confucius about his followers. So the speculation is at this point Confucius was probably sufficiently old that he wasn't really looking for a job anymore, that he'd kind of pitched that over, and he was just well known as being a bright guy, but he was more interested in advancing the careers of his students than of himself necessarily having a career. So he's asked, hey, could Zhu be appointed a minister? And he said, Yu has resolve. What difficulty would he have governing? And then he was asked, can Si be appointed to a minister? And Confucius says, Si has understanding. What trouble would he have in being a minister or governing? And then he said, can Q be appointed a minister, or Qui? And he said, Qui is accomplished in the arts. What difficulty would he have in being a governor? Again, so this is the idea. And here's wisdom, by the way. This is a notion of wisdom and discernment, also, of course, speaking the truth, these sorts of things. So he's asked, of these three students, could they be ministers? And notice he says, one, Yu has resolve. Now, resolve is an important element for any minister to have, of course. And he says, Si has understanding. Okay, this is an important quality for any minister to have. And then Ku, or Ki, is accomplished in the arts. Again, this is an important quality to have. But look what Confucius is doing here. Again, it's subtle, but not that subtle. One, he's saying, I have three students. Each of them would be good as a minister. However, the quality each has is different. So notice there is not a good minister. I mean, ideally, the perfect gentleman would incarnate every value perfectly balanced. This would be a sage. Confucius mentions this many times. If you get everything perfectly balanced, then you're a sage. Those people are great. There's just not a lot of them. We're dealing with real people. Again, make a note of this, by the way. He consistently emphasizes that these aren't supermen. These are not, they are superior, but they're superior in their humaneness and in their understanding and in their wisdom. They aren't extra human. They're going to have flaws, they're going to struggle, they're going to have doubts. And so what you're looking for is a person who has the qualities of a minister, who is striving to be better and who is striving to do the right thing, not that they're going to get it right all the time. These are very different aspects. And if you, as you read them, you'll see that he mentions sages a lot regularly throughout the Analects. But again, sages, there's one or two that have ever been. And so let's not worry about that. Let's deal with the real people. In this case, is three followers. So one has resolve, one has understanding, and one has understanding of the arts, or is training in the arts. So different ministers need different qualities. So someone who has resolve, maybe giving a big engineering project, because they're always trying to control floods, for instance, would be different than someone who has understanding, who's maybe given difficult negotiations with a border kingdom or something, which is different from someone who has understanding of the arts, who might be able to be put in charge of the court or ritual propriety, or maybe would make a great ambassador because he would be well received and pleasing, and people would accept him as a knowledgeable and educated man. And so so wisdom, again, what this is an example of is the ability to discern that different people have different qualities, that different ministers need to have different qualities, that there isn't a single magic minister who can do everything at all times under all circumstances, and that knowing the difference and being able to identify them is why people go to Confucius, that this is what wisdom and learning is about. Also, this is an example of him trying to speak truthfully, right? He doesn't ever say like, he doesn't say C has resolve but is ignorant of other things. He doesn't say, Qui has every possible skill, definitely appoint him, he's the greatest guy ever. He says, look, here's their characteristics. I think those characteristics qualify him to be a minister. You need to pick which of these characteristics you think is most important to you, so that you know what it is you want the person to do. And this is another aspect that's worth mentioning is many of the Analects, many of the little passages have an educational component for rulers. So when they ask Confucius a question, the way he answers often says a lot more than what his answers are. So in this case, he doesn't say to the ruler, the important person, that, hey, don't ask me a stupid question like that. You need to know what kind of position you're trying to fill, and then I can, come up with a better answer. What he says is, hey, here's 3 different people who each could rule well, but they have 3 different skill sets. Which do you think is going to be best for you? So he does this very subtly, but it's clear there that this is both emblematic of his discernment and his knowledge, but it's also educational for the ruler to say, ooh, I don't want to be rude. I don't want to be over direct. I don't want to make this about me. I don't want to be critical, but you need to be aware that here's some good qualities that ministers have. That's a nice list of good qualities. And you need to know which you want. So you asked one question, could they be ministers? But he actually answers with another question. And again, this is why the Analects seem simple on the surface. I mean, they seem confusing because of the historical references and stuff. Okay, that's there. But when you get past that, they seem pretty simple. Oh, that kind of straightforward. That's kind of. And then the more you think about them and reflect on them, you're like, oh, this guy really is. He's walking a lot of high wires here. He's being very careful. He's trying to communicate a lot in a short space. And hence there's been, thousands of years of scholarship on pondering these. So then 9.4, and this is on sort of Jin truthfulness, which is related, of course, to 6.8. These all build on each other because how could they not? And in 9.4, he asks about truthfulness, and he says the master forbids 4 things. One must one must not act on guesses. One must not demand absolute certainty. One must not be stubborn, and one must not insist on oneself. Now, those seem pretty simple and pretty straightforward, but look how they build. One must not act on guesses. So don't just take a stab, right? Just don't fool yourself or come up with a theory or come up with an abstract idea and just, I got to go with this. I don't have anything else to go with. So don't just guess, right? That's wrong. If you don't know, don't act. And you'll see this consistently in Confucianism, which is very different from Western tradition, particularly coming from the Romans and the Greeks. The always err on the side of not doing anything. The Greeks pretty much always erred on the side of doing stuff. And Confucius is always saying, hey, when in doubt, take a moment, reflect, don't do, right? Don't do any harm, sort of the Hippocratic oath. If nothing else, just don't do anything because otherwise you might do harm. So first one part of truthfulness is to not act just on a guess or a whim or an intuition or something. The second one, which would seem to be almost contradictory, which is one must not demand absolute certainty. So on one hand, look, don't just guess and pretend like you know something and go with it because you have a plan or who knows. But on the other hand, don't wait around until you absolutely have all the facts and you know everything. Because this is not going to happen. This is the real world. You have to do the best you can with what you're given. And so again, this is the opposite of having clear rules, clear guidelines. It continuously, throughout the Analects, it asks for people to make judgments. And the quality of those judgments will be determined by, of course, the humaneness, the righteousness, the wisdom of the individual. How much of they are a gentleman is the ability to give these situations, which are dicey. You don't have full information. You don't want to act on a guess, but you need to make a decision, right? Don't wait for or demand absolute certainty because it's not that kind of world. It's, this is going to be rare and difficult to come by. And also, there's no challenge in that, right? It's anybody can make those decisions when you're 100% sure of what's going on and 100% sure of what the outcomes are. Great, and anybody can do that. It's a gentleman. It takes wisdom and insight to be able to act and advise and move effectively in environments of imperfect information where one doesn't know, where one is at risk and can't demand or shouldn't demand absolute certainty. Then one must not be stubborn. So if a decision has been made and evidence starts to come in that something is going wrong, or that you've made the wrong decision, or that the idea that you had is proven to be false, don't stick with it, right? Don't simply go, oh, I had this theory, I had this idea, I went with it, I'm sure it's true. And even if stuff comes back, I'm going to go, no, I'm absolutely still sure it's true. You can almost read this as being anti-faith, right? Confucius is not he's not big on faith. Anyway, it's not that sort of program, but he's like, look, don't just be stubborn, right? Don't just believe something because, and don't act on something because. You have to look at outcome. You have to look at results. You have to look at new information that comes to you. If you don't, well, then you're just being stubborn and you're being stuck on things that are important to you and your obsessions and your preconceived ideas rather than to what's really going on, being open-hearted again, being aware, being willing to reflect and question. Which, of course, gives you to the last step of this. This is 9.4 again, by the way, chapter 9.4. One must not insist on oneself. And so you are not the Messiah coming out of the desert. You are not the prophet who has seen the vision from God saying, this is how it is. I know this is how it is. This is absolutely what must happen. It's very much the opposite. It's not about you again, right? So this is 1.3. Hey, be leery of these people who are too crafty. Be leery of people in rituals who are too extravagant. They're putting themselves to the fore. They're putting themselves to the fore. If the situation is not about you and the minister is not obsessed with themselves, then they shouldn't be stubborn in the face of new ideas and evidence. They should be open to it because that's all. It's not about them. It's not about them being right or wrong. They don't care about them being right or wrong. That was never a consideration. It's what evidence do I have? What decisions do I make? What insights do I have? What can I do to make that manifest? New stuff comes up, then you go with the new stuff. It's just both that simple and that impossible, of course. So this notion, again, I'm sure you're realizing by now how interleaved these are, and this is interleaved throughout the Confucian, the Analects. You get these over and over these ideas that reinforce each other. Is, hey, you need to be a person of discernment who can make judgments under difficult conditions, but you can't then be dedicated to or committed to these ideas or specific outcomes when the evidence runs against you. It's sort of a pragmatism, but it's a pragmatism within a much bigger context than just, getting the outcome you want, because the outcome you want comes from doing humane things in an upright way, which doesn't mean not making errors. It means addressing errors when they occur and trying to mitigate damage when it's necessary. And so it's not about perfect men executing perfect laws in a perfect society. It's about imperfect men struggling to do the best they can in difficult situations and being willing to change and being big enough to, in their humaneness, to say, oh, well, this isn't working. Let's try something else. Let's move in a different direction. And so part of being truthful, part of being honest is each of these steps. Don't guess, right? That's kind of a guess is a kind of lie. If you present it as anything other than a guess, right, which we tend not to do. Don't demand the sort of certitude that's just not available to you, right? That the absolute certitude isn't available, so don't ask for it and don't pretend like you have it, right? These are two errors. Then don't be stubborn. Don't persist in things that are failing or that have come out wrong just because. And then, of course, as related, don't make it about you. Don't put yourself forward. It's not about what's good for you. It's not like the outcome matters to you. You're always working for a larger goal because, again, this is what ministers are supposed to be doing. If you think about that, one of the famous characters in there is a probably mythological figure who was the earliest one to like begin taming the rivers with canals and dams and things. And it's like, oh, he spent his life channeling these rivers so that people didn't flood and you had these recurrent famines and horrible destruction of life and property. And that is super noble. It's not imperfect. It's not there were never floods, but he did make headway in taming them. He did improve life for a lot of people. This makes a huge difference. But if you're doing something and it makes the floods worse, stop, right? Like, don't do that anymore. However, the tendency is for governments and government officials and people of all kinds to go, oh, if they make a mistake, if they admit they made a mistake, oh, that's really bad. Again, you see this consistently in our current political discourse where, basically if anybody admits they make a mistake, the media, the other party, whoever, will just eviscerate them rather than being able to say, oh, yeah, look, no, we tried that didn't work. Let's move along. No, that's death, right? So you pretend like everything's going great. You close your eyes and just, whistle along as if nothing has ever gone wrong, because we know no errors have been made in governance in the last 100 or 200 years, right? And then finally, this is 12:16, and this is one of my favorite ones. And again, of course, interleaves with all of these. 9:4 ends on one must not insist on oneself. And then 12:16 wraps up with, it doesn't wrap up with, it's just what it says. It says, what makes a gentleman, again, this comes up about 100 times in the Analects. The gentleman helps bring out the good in people, not the bad. A small man does the opposite. So it's not just about not putting yourself forward. A gentleman is the one who can bring out the best in other people. You help them be better people. You help them be more successful. You help them be wiser. You help them be more humane. And by elevating them, you're not elevating yourself, you're elevating them. You're elevating the people around you. You make them better versions of them. And of course, this takes the wisdom to discern what their characters are and the capacity to understand the elements that are going to give them the best opportunity to succeed and present the best sides of themselves. And that drive, that core focus, means not focusing on yourself. It's not about making yourself look good or bringing out your best qualities. The gentleman is always concerned with and focused on bringing out the best in others, making others look good, making them be their best. And that, to me, sort of encapsulates a lot of this, because it requires, discernment, the ability, the wisdom to understand this, the ability to have the self-awareness to create space for people to express themselves as fully as possible, and to make it easy for them to do that, to emphasize their good and de-emphasize in them what might be their problematic aspects or their flaws. So that, and the theory here, Confucius is clear on this throughout the Analects, is this is how you train people up. You model the good, you help them express their good, and if this happens long enough and consistently enough, then the good grows and is nurtured, and the bad or the flaws shrink and become less prominent. Again, back to the one we struggle with most with is understanding ritual propriety. This is what he thought ritual propriety did, is it helped train up the right mind, the right focus, the right sensibility in people so that their goodness could come to the fore. And the small man, conversely, says a small man does exactly the opposite. The small man tries to make other people look bad because then in comparison, they look good. I knock them down so that I stand taller, rather than trying to raise them up so they can be as big as they can possibly be. And that sounds very simple and very humane and very direct. But I remember years ago, because it's stuck in my mind, it's one of those errors you make when you're young and naive. There was a guy, what was his name? Peters or Peterson or something? Maybe it's Peters. He wrote a bunch of bestsellers about how to be a CEO and all this, which I never understand why these books are bestsellers, but whatever. And then there he talked about the fact that one of the things he realized is that most companies do not try to hire the best people, and they certainly don't try to promote the best people, because what this does is it threatens everybody around them, and they don't try to nurture and train, they try to keep themselves promoted and climbing the ladder. And so I don't want someone below me to outshine me, because then they're going to pass me up. And when I read this, I don't know, 30 years ago, I thought, well, that's ridiculous. Like, of course, people, that's not how they do this. This is absurd. Of course, people want the people around them to succeed and do well, and we're all in this together, etc., etc. Of course, that was just stupid, wrong, and naive. I should have read Confucius from 2,500 years ago, because he was much clearer on this, and he understood that just the opposite is very, very much more how the world works consistently. And that from direct experience, from talking to other people, you see this over and over again, that people feel threatened by other people doing well, and so they tend not to want to nurture it or want it to be highlighted. And I thought the least Confucius, or one of the least Confucius things I'd ever heard of, was Microsoft for a long time had this incredibly toxic work environment, because every team, let's say you had a team of 10 people, every quarter, I think, or every 6 months, you were graded. And the bottom of the team, if you got the lowest grade for a year, you would be fired. And whoever got the highest grades would be promoted. And so, wow, talk about creating a perverse incentive environment. So you have these people who are theoretically working together, who are supposed to be working as a team, and what you've done is create an environment where everybody wants to sandbag everybody else, make them look bad, and then you can make yourself look good, because if you get the highest scores, you get promoted, and those people are going to get demoted or fired. And so there's a lot on the line, and so everybody goes to war with each other. So we're not trying to promote. In theory, this was supposed to bring out the best, and the best people would shine, and there'd be this dog-eat-dog competition to see who stands bloodied at the top of the pile of corpses at the end of this. And that there is that notion of competition brings out the best. The Confucian idea, very different from this. It is the idea that, if we work together, and if superior leaders cultivate and model the best behavior and highlight the best aspects of those who are inferior in theory to them, then those people can grow and shine and become great too. And this all contributes to the greater good. And because great people and people of great humaneness, great rin, and gentlemen are rare, there's no dearth of them, right? There is a dearth of them. So we need to cultivate them and grow them, not have a competition to weed them out. And so it's this almost, 180. It's like the almost reverse view. It's like you don't want competition. You want mutual support and the capacity to try and bring out and cultivate the best in each other. This is how things work well. As opposed to it's a dog-eat-dog world, we all have to kill each other and fight our ways to the top, which is what is sort of, I thought, in the Microsoft example, or you see it all over in the corporate world, you see it in a lot of places where people don't want other people to do well, because that means they're going to outcompete them. And so they do everything they can to make sure they look good and the other person looks bad. And of course, Confucius, this is what makes you a small man. And I always remember this, because when I see that passage, which I've read many times over the years, I'm like, I had that 100% wrong. Because I thought, well, of course, right? You go to class and you're in class and we're all working together to get good grades. And then pretty soon you find out that a lot of people are there so that they look good and you look bad. And if they can make you look bad, then that's good enough for them, because by comparison, they'll look good. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to improve. They don't have to model, etc., etc. And so, that was the wisdom of Confucius that came to me very late, but he had it 2,500 years earlier. So 5 passages. And the idea here is to model what it means to stop and read slowly through some, 5 of, I forget how many passages there are on the Analects, a lot. But just to take a moment and reflect and think and sort of work through these in details. And by the way, just to refresh, those were chapters 1.3, 3.4, 6.8, 9.4, and 12.16. 12.16, that sounds weird. 12.16, 12.16. Yeah. So those are the 5 passages that I went through somewhat in detail. Actually, not that much detail, but even going slowly, you realize how much time you can spend thinking about and reflecting on these. And to bring back full circle, this was all about Confucius's attempt to create superior humans, not superhumans, not Nietzsche's Übermensch, not these kinds of things. It was to just create not the philosopher kings of Plato's Republic. No, it was to create humans, but really good humans, but still humans, and to put them in complex situations where you're not going to know, and there's going to be doubt, and we're going to have struggles, but we're pretty good humans, and so we're doing the best we can, and we're trying to keep the other humans in mind. And that's what a gentleman is someone who strives for that. So, Confucius Analects, a slow read through a few passages, and I hope to do 2 things with this. One is, cover the Analects, which is always worth doing because you can see these values. Essentially, I think at some levels, I just find this all totally agreeable. And so I've struggled to be probably sufficiently critical of these passages because I'm like, man, I just think he had so much that was just pretty much spot on. And 2, to model when you're reading philosophy, don't worry about speed. Don't worry about going fast. Just think about taking a moment and taking one paragraph and maybe spend a day, a week, a month on it, and really just reflect and kick it around because there's so much good material in something like the Analects. But it does take a bit of teasing. It does take a bit of reflecting, and ideally it takes some conversation as well. Always valuable when thinking about these things. And final note, again, Book Connect, still doing this. If you're interested, I'll put a link down below. You can get this. You can read the Analects on there, take some notes, and then in about 10 days from now, we'll do another live class. And these have been going great conversations, and people have been on. We have a Discord now, and people have been having very good conversations about the texts we're reading and about other texts. So it's really growing into this kind of interesting conversation around the texts. So if you're interested in doing the Analects some more, if you thought this was an interesting introduction, feel free to click on over and read the Analects, and then we'll have a class for everybody in about 10 days. And thanks very much. Hope to see you taking notes on this in Book Connect and in the class. If not, that's great too. Hope you enjoyed Confucius and the 2,500 years of wisdom that he's been sort of handing down to us in one of the great collections of human thought and of really great heartedness that I think you'll ever read. Thank you very much.